matter who you are, this year has been tough. These are trying times.
There has been trouble, sorrow, anger, and fear all around.
It's been hard to connect, hard to take it all in, hard to understand.
Our country is still dealing with the same issues that occurred in Tulsa 100 years ago.
The same problems that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. fought so hard to change.
Injustice, inequality, inequity, and systemic racism have once again been brought into focus.
But in the midst of turmoil, there has been hope.
In the last year, the YMCA of Greater Boston has worked tirelessly to nurture our beloved community, even when we can't physically be together.
By working together, we've shared the trouble, and by connecting, have tried to lighten the load on others.
This year, we have worked to prevent hunger and support our essential workers and their families,
and to help our children access the educational support they need to carry them into a brighter future.
Together, we have met the challenges faced, and we stand firmly together to face what is to come.
We're now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today.
We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late.
This is no time for apathy or complacency.
This is a time for vigorous and positive action. Now it's our time to carry on the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
It's my responsibility,
Your responsibility.
Our responsibility to care for one another, to continue to make our voice heard,
To reach out to each other with love, respect, with kindness and understanding.
Knowing in our hearts what is right and refusing to let these times sway our path forward.
If you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl.
But whatever you do, you have to keep moving forward.
Now, join the Roxbury YMCA as we celebrate the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Join us as we continue to honor the legacy of hope.
We're happy this morning that you joined us for this breakfast, and we ask that you prepare your hearts and minds for our invocation. Let us bow. O God, our God in ages past, and our hope for years to come, a shelter from a stormy blast and our eternal home. God, we come to you on this day to honor a man whose life was an embodiment of love, peace, and righteousness. But yet, God, we come to you this day in a different fashion. We come facing the difficult realities of this pandemic. Millions have contracted a virus, and some over 385,000 people in this country have lost their lives. But God, we still come in the spirit of resilience. And we know this spirit because leaders like Dr. King taught us how to be resilient through the power of righteous resistance. So God, we come to you on this day to honor a great man, a man who stood at the forefront of a movement for justice, a man who stepped out into the dangerous shadows of America and shined the light of nonviolence, a man who saw the ignorance and incivility of a society and saw a way to be an inspiration to the nation. And although hatred took his life, it could not take his legacy. And so, God, we come on this day in the spirit of King, a spirit of resilience, but also a spirit of resistance. Resilience in the face of this pandemic, but resistance against systemic racism. And so we pray to you on this day that you, Almighty, will allow us to weave our lives into his legacy so that we can aid in continuing to do the work that Dr. King called for to create that beloved community, knowing that darkness cannot drive out darkness, Only light can do that. And that hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. And so as I close on this day, I pray that all the things that happen in this breakfast will be done to the glory of you. And God, I pray that we continue to pursue justice and seek liberation. For when every heart joins every heart together and yearns for liberty, that's when we'll be free. When every hand joins every hand and together molds our destiny, that's when we'll be free. Any hour, any day, and the time soon will come when me and in the will live in dignity. That's when we'll be free. And we can sing in the legacy of that old Negro spiritual, oh freedom, oh freedom, oh freedom over me. And so we pray together on this day. Bless our engagements. Bless our time together. And we will give you all glory, honor, and praise. I give you this prayer in the name of the one who I call Jesus Christ, my Lord and Savior. Let every heart and mind say, amen.
Good morning, and welcome to the 13th annual Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. celebration presented by the Roxbury YMCA. I am Wilton Devon Baker, chair of the Roxbury Y Advisory Board. I am grateful for the work of Catherine Saunders, executive director of the Roxbury Y, and James Morton, president and CEO of the Greater Boston YMCA, for their strategic leadership of our institution during these harrowing times. I am also grateful for our corporate partners that supported us during these times and ensured our celebration. Finally, it's my pleasure to introduce our conversationalists, my Morehouse brothers, Doctors Ronald S. Sullivan Jr., director of the Criminal Justice Institute at the Harvard Law School, and Eddie S. Glaude Jr., department chair of African American Studies, Princeton University. James Morton will moderate. Enjoy.
That one day this nation will rise up and live out its true meaning of its treaties. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are equal.
I have a dream that one day my 4 little children will live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character.
This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning. My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing, and if America is to be a great nation, this must become true.
Let freedom ring. When we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, in every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day.
When all of God's chosen black men, white men, Jews, and Gentiles, Protestants, and Catholics will be able to join hands and sing.
All right, we are here to celebrate the 2021 Roxbury YMCA MLK Breakfast. We do this each and every year, and it allows us an opportunity to celebrate the life and times of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the many contributions he made to our consciousness as individuals, as a people, as a city, and as a nation. Before we go on any further, let's take a moment to thank our Executive Director, Catherine Saunders, for the great leadership that she provides to the Roxbury YMCA. And let's also thank our Chief Development Officer, Todd Tooney, for his contributions to today's event. There's been lots going on in the world today. And every year when we have our Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. celebration, we are compelled to ask ourselves, well, what would Dr. King think about this, and what would Dr. King think about that? Well, we would ask ourselves today, what would Dr. King think about the plight of Black Americans during this time of the coronavirus? What would he think about the nation's response to the coronavirus? What would he think about the disparities that the coronavirus has unveiled, the disparities in health and wealth and education? What would he think about those? What would he think about the recent presidential election and the polarization that has occurred in America? What would Dr. King think about the recent insurrection? We ask ourselves, what would Dr. King think about these things? And I remember so vividly Dr. Sullivan's presentation as our keynote a couple of years ago, where he asked us to think more about what would Dr. King ask us to do, not so much about what Dr. King might think. And so I would ask us in this time, what would Dr. King ask us to do in addressing these issues? And that is going to be the subject of our courageous conversation today. It's going to be about doing. It's going to be about action steps that we can take to address the challenges of these perilous and challenging times. And so today I have the honor of serving as a moderator of this presentation. And frankly, there is no moderator needed with respect to these two amazing individuals who will share their thoughts with us. And so let me introduce our distinguished guests. And I will do so by sharing what they have in common. So both of them are Morehouse men. They are graduates of Morehouse College. Both are professors of distinction at Ivy League colleges. Both are highly sought after as speakers and are accomplished orators. Both have appeared on a number of different news programs and our major networks. Both of them, by their words and deeds, are social activists. And both of them challenge us to think about not how great we are, but how great we could be. They both challenge us to reimagine ourselves and to reimagine our institutions. And so let me begin by introducing Dr. Ron Sullivan Jr. He is no mystery to us. He served as our keynote speaker and did an amazing job a couple of years ago at this very event. So this is his second appearance for our annual celebration of Dr. King. Dr. Sullivan is a leading theorist on the area of criminal law, trial practice, legal ethics, and race theory. He is a professor at the Harvard University School of Law. He's the director of Harvard Law School's Criminal Justice Institute, and he's also faculty dean at Harvard College. He has served in the past as an advisor to President Obama on a multitude of different issues, and he has also served on a committee that helped Kenya draft a new constitution. I would go on endlessly if I tried to capture all of his many contributions as outlined in his resume. Why don't we just suffice it to say that Dr. Ron Sullivan is a friend of the Y of Greater Boston, a friend of the Roxbury Y, and he's a bad man. And our next guest is also very distinguished, Dr. Eddie Glaude Jr. Dr. Glaude holds a PhD in religion from Princeton University and is the James S. McDonnell Distinguished University Professor and Chair of the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University. He's an accomplished writer, having published several books regarding the American experience, James Baldwin, religion, social justice, and other topics. He is a highly sought after speaker. In fact, the African American CEOs of the YMCA have sought his at our next Undoing Racism conference, and we shared that a moment ago. And he also regularly appears on Meet the Press, Morning Joe, and Deadline White House with Nicole Wallace. So permit me to introduce another bad brother, Dr. Eddie Glaude Jr.
Thank you.
All right. So before we jump into the topic of today, as we approach this conversation, we do so with a certain degree of sadness and disappointment and despair. And so I would ask each of you to share your thoughts on as it's being characterized, the insurrection and assault, encouraged, or more than kind of encouraged, almost totally encouraged by President Trump. And so what I'd like to do is offer each of you the opportunity to share your thoughts on what you think of those events, and give each of you a couple of minutes for that. Dr. Glaude, could you start us off on that topic?
Sure. And please call me Eddie. It's such a delight to be in conversation with you, Brother James, and then my dear friend, one of my oldest friends, Ronald Sullivan. I've been a recipient of his brilliance for so many these years, and just blessed to call him a friend. There's an interesting moment at Mason Temple in April of 1968, the day before Dr. King is assassinated. He gives his famous "I've been to the mountaintop" speech. And, typical of Americans, we tend to rush to the conclusion. I've been to the mountaintop. I don't know how, I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. It's like certain kinds of Christians. They want to run past Saturday to get to Sunday. Mm-hmm. There's something that King says in that moment prior to that formulation. He says, I don't know what's going to happen to me now. We have some difficult days ahead. And then he makes the claim. Mm-hmm. And so he didn't give us a time frame. And so we're still in those difficult days. The country hasn't dealt honestly with the contradiction at the heart of its founding. And what we've seen over the last 4 years is a man who is not committed to any kind of democratic norms, exploit the imperial presidency, to weaponize very clearly deeply held racial resentments. We've seen the combination of greed and grievance, race and resentment, hubris and hatred. And we knew that this was going to happen. He said January 6th was going to be a wild day, to paraphrase him. Yeah. And so what we've witnessed is not just simply an insurrection, but a moment in which our democracy stands on a knife's edge. And let me say this very quickly. The way in which the police responded reveals that there are some people who have the full benefits of a robust conception of citizenship. And then there are those of us who have a kind of attenuated citizenship. The way the police responded to those white bodies compared to how police have responded to Black Lives Matter protests, the way police have responded to us, a traffic stop, a little child playing in a a playground. You could be in the privacy of your own room, on your own home. You could be in your garage, right? We know that there are different sorts of ways in which police respond. So what was in full view for me, at least, the difficult days that Dr. King talked about, and the fact that our democracy stands on a knife's edge. And lastly, the fact that race, this idea that white people matter more than others, continues to animate much of our life in this country. And we saw it in full view in that horrible moment of the siege of the People's House, of the sacking of the People's House.
Dr. Sullivan.
Thanks so much, James. And I would like to echo what Eddie said. It's a pleasure being here, and also echo the depth of our long-term friendship. We met literally as children and went through Morehouse together and grew up together and learned from each other, supported each other, cried with each other. It's been a very long journey, but my life has been enriched considerably having known my good friend over there. So it's a pleasure to be back at the Y virtually, and a pleasure to do this with my good friend Dr. Glaude. I certainly will agree with everything that Eddie said, and also add that that siege of the Capitol, and I will use the I word, that attempted insurrection, is an important lesson in democracy. And it's a lesson that our democracy is not self-sustaining. You can't just wake up in the morning and think that this democracy is going to keep going. It requires work, it requires maintenance, it requires us to roll up our sleeves and do the things required to make this experiment work. When we stop doing those things, we can see how events can change the course of our traditions radically. One of the most difficult and actually sad aspects of our current existence is how ahistorical the public is. We have, generally speaking, we've got no sense of how quickly things can topple, how quickly things can turn, and we can be living in a very different place very, very quickly. And we've got historical precedents right behind us in other parts of the world when things just dramatically turned around. And if we're not careful, if we don't take care of this thing that we have, this incredible experiment that is far from perfect but has the potential to do a lot of good, if we don't care for it, we're going to wake up one morning and be in a space that is absolutely untenable for everybody. This is a reminder that things can happen really quickly. Things can change really quickly. I also want to pick up on one other thing that Eddie mentioned. Eddie mentioned the word norms, the way in which the president does not respect the norms of our country. So there's a limit to which you can legislate things. There just aren't enough words in the lexicon to cover every particular circumstance that may come. Our finite minds cannot even imagine everything that might happen, that could happen. But in order to account for those things, that we survive by a set of norms that guide us in the way in which we practice our democracy. It's not law. You can't go to court to defend it, but it's a behavior. It's a way in which we act. And for those norms to work, you have to believe that there exists some principle bigger than your self-interest. One has to be willing to subordinate individual interests to the social good. And without that, we're doomed. So on that pleasant note, I'll yield.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for both of you for your insights and your thoughts. I know that was kind of last minute, but I appreciate you take a moment to share your thinking. And obviously, as we can all tell, this isn't the first time you thought about it. You have given deep thought to it. So thank you for sharing your insights with us. And so let us turn our attention to the courageous topic before us this morning. And this conversation is about the economics of caring, honesty, respect, and responsibility as it pertains to the Black community and other communities of color. And so that then leads us to the first question before us, and that is, what is the economic impact when we adhere to our core values of caring, honesty, respect, and responsibility, especially during a pandemic period like the coronavirus? A related question might be, what is the impact on our institutions, our government, our education system, our healthcare system, and our financial institutions when we try to retain those core values while at the same time having those institutions do the jobs that they're intended to do? So what are your thoughts? Let's start with you, Ron. What are your thoughts on that particular topic?
Well, we know as a descriptive matter that the economic impact on our institutions during this COVID period has been significant. It's taken a huge toll on our economies, and it's changed our institutions and morphed them in ways that we simply hadn't imagined. As a prescriptive matter, as a way to think about how to go forward in periods of crisis, in periods of national crisis, we all have a shared responsibility to shoulder some of the burden. We gladly take in the benefits of our institutions, of our cities and our governments, but the other side of the coin is burdens. And we have to take on those burdens as graciously as we accept the benefits. So in times where folk are in need, and we have this disparate healthcare system, we have structural economic inequalities at place, my view is that everyone has to step up. All institutions have to step up and accept some of those burdens. Profit motive alone simply cannot stand as the prime motivator for institutions to act, but rather we have to recognize that we are in a 100-year cycle, a global pandemic that requires more of us. So on an individual level, more charity, more caring. If nothing else, COVID has given us the space to look over at our neighbors and care, to think that there may be folk in need. For young people who the data show are not impacted by the virus in the way that people as old as Eddie might be impacted, they have to care. They have to push down self-interest and say, although I'm not impacted, I have to behave in a way because I care about these other people in our community. And the same is true for our corporate persons, for our institutions. That is that they have to behave in a way that's responsible to the public. For it is this notion of the commonweal, or the common good that will allow us to get through this thing. We did a horrendous job. We did a horrendous job with this virus, and with the new mutation of the virus, we now have an opportunity to do better. And we certainly can't do worse because that means dead bodies, hundreds of thousands of dead bodies. So I would say that we need to take this opportunity to do better, looking at subordinating self-interest in favor of broader interests.
Thank you.
It's always hard to follow, Sully, and for obvious reasons. But let's talk about this. What does it mean to imagine, right, an economic approach that presumes the core values of the YMCA, right? Well, one of the first things that follow from it, right, from those sorts of commitments, right, is that you immediately begin or you proceed with the assumption that nobody's disposable, that every human being is valued, no matter your zip code, no matter the color of your skin, no matter who you love, right? No, everyone is valued. So an ethic of care animates how we budget, how we respond. What does it mean to be caring? What does it mean to be honest? What does it mean to be respectful? What does it mean to be responsible for one's fellows, right? And so the first thing we begin with is it automatically tempers a certain understanding of the free market. It automatically tempers a certain understanding of capitalism, right? That you don't proceed on the assumption that you can just cast people away, right? And so that would then lead to a kind of an examination. And I'm just echoing a lot of what Professor Sullivan said, is that it leads to an examination of the nature of our social contract with each other. And I'm not talking about Locke, and I'm not talking about Hobbes. I'm talking about what is our obligation to each other in community with each other. right? Or are we simply self-interested persons in pursuit of our own selfish aims and ends, without any regard for our fellows, only in competition and rivalry with them? For the last 40 years, we have been living in a country that has been dominated by a political ideology that has transformed us from citizens in communion with each other, people in communion with each other who care about each other, right, to self-interested persons in competition and rivalry with each other. And so any idea of a robust conception of the public good gets eviscerated because I can get in mine. You even have a form of Christian gospel called prosperity gospel that reflects that ideology, you see. So what does it mean to rethink this social contract? Or to ask the questions, what are our obligations to each other in light of these core values of care, of being honest about who we are, of being respectful of the dignity and standing of every human being, and being responsible to each other, right? So then it requires an assessment of where we are, because what COVID has revealed, right? It's like a blue dye shot in the body. It has revealed all of the fissures, right? All of the inequalities, right? That define the body politic, that define our way of life. And we know that the virus has metastasized in the deep inequalities that define American life. So it's not just simply Black and brown people who are dying disproportionately, it's poor people who are dying disproportionately, right? It's indiscriminate in how it's attacking folk, but there are certain folk who are in the way, who are predisposed in some ways because of their form of life, right? The way they live, right? To be exposed to the virus, to be vulnerable to the virus. And so part of what COVID has revealed is that this ideology that has defined us, defined our way of life for the last 40 years, right, has led to a shredding of the social safety net. This idea of an ethic of care, that's the first value that's mentioned. What has happened to the social safety net over the last 40 years, right? Do for yourself, right? And an attack on government responsibility to its citizens, a relabeling of government programs as entitlement programs, right? We get a kind of an evisceration, a wholesale attack on our responsibility to the elderly, our responsibility to the indigent, our responsibility to those who have mental health crises, our responsibility to our fellows. So America has spent, the United States has spent more money in response to COVID than any country in the industrialized world. Why? Because we didn't have a social safety net in place prior to COVID hitting, right? And so the amount of monies we're spending and we're not responding in a substantive way, I'm going on too long here, right? Has everything to do with an economic and political philosophy that has presumed that some people are disposable, that has shredded the social contract, which would evidence the values that animate the YMCA, right? And has led us to this moment where over 350,000 of our fellows are dead, and we have to ask the question, for what? It's not just simply the incompetence of the Trump administration. It has something to do with an ideology that has presupposed that the federal government is bad by definition, and that social programs that follow from a big government is tyrannical, is in some ways an infringement upon my liberty, where liberty has become a synonym for selfishness, right? So to begin with these values, it seems to me, these core values, is to announce a different relationship to a certain economic system, right? A different relationship to the free market, right? To understand the role of government, right? And to understand the limits of charity understood in a particular sort of way, right? That, certain kinds of philanthropic enterprises are designed to obscure the deep inequalities that make philanthropy necessary in the first place, if that makes sense. But I'm going on and on and on and on. I'll shut up.
So let's go to our next question, and that is, what is the role of I don't want to make this YMCA centric. So let's just talk about what is the role of community-based organizations during times like these? What is it that we should be doing in order to address the issues that we find ourselves confronted with as a country?
Just really quickly, I'll say this: given the wholesale attack on government that we've experienced over the last 40 years, it makes sense that I mean, let me just say it differently. There is a reason why Trump and his minions have made the argument that the states ought to be responsible for responding to COVID-19. That actually reflects an ideological position, not just simply incompetence, right? And so, because of this wholesale attack on the role of federal government, you even heard it in the language of Ben Sass recently, that organizations like the YMCA take on a very important role, right, in responding to crises that communities experience, right? Precisely because the state largely has, in some ways, abdicated its responsibility to many of us. And so the response is at least for me, is to really speak to the needs of everyday ordinary folk, particularly communities that are vulnerable. Some folks can't shelter in place. To shelter in place actually makes them even more vulnerable to the virus because there's so many people living in the home, right? And we can go on and on and on. So the way in which I would respond to the question directly is, how do we speak to the need of housing insecurity? How do we speak to the need of food insecurity? How do we speak to the fact that large numbers of folk are unemployed, and the fact that that their way of life was already precarious, and because of the impact of the virus, that precarity has deepened. So we have to speak to these deep, basic, foundational issues so that people can keep their noses above water in the midst of all of this.
I'd echo that, and I actually agree wholeheartedly with that analysis. Government does not operate simply by a set of mechanisms. Rather, the conduct of government proceeds from an ideology that deals with our conception of the relationship between the individual and the state. And as Dr. Glaude points out, to the degree that our conception of that relationship between the individual and the state derives from a rugged frontiersman type of rugged individualism attitude, then the mechanisms of government produce policies that are skewed in that favor and don't look to people in need. So at some point, maybe we'll talk about the ideology as well and how to break that cycle. But while we are in it, it outsizes the need for organizations like yours. And so, James, I know you, you'd be delighted if the places like the Y were obsolete one day.
Absolutely.
You'd be absolutely delighted. But right now, the need is outsized because we have an unchecked ideology. When I say unchecked, I rather say uninterrogated ideology of a form of individualism that elides over all sorts of structural problems that impact people in ways such that they require some extra services. So while we are in this mess, organizations like the Y have to step up in plain and ordinary English and do more. Look, we live in a particular political economy where what was the famous Reagan thing? I'm from the government and I'm here to help. He says the worst, how many ever number words that is in the English language. That's dangerous. That's absolutely dangerous.
Absolutely.
We don't, this is not the wild, wild west here. We are interdependent. We depend upon each other in order to get along in this country and in this world. So organizations like yours, unfortunately, are not obsolete and have to do more. As you know, you and I recently worked on a project where we helped to feed people in need and hire people and teach them habits of mind about getting up and going to work and so forth, and just try to do a little bit in communities most in need. So when you see your fellow in need, when you see your brother, when you see your sister in need, it's incumbent upon all of us, service organizations like yours, individuals like me and Eddie, institutions like Harvard and Princeton, and the federal government. And the way we speak to the federal government is through our elected representatives. Garbage in, garbage out, right? You get out of something what you put in. If you don't like what your representatives are doing, elect new ones. Elect ones who are going to do the sorts of things, who mirror your values, who are going to represent you, who are going to represent your values, your cares, your aspirations. So now I'm going on and on, but those are my initial thoughts on that topic.
Well, thank you both. One last question, and maybe the most profound of the questions of today, and that is, what is the correlation or the relationship between these core values and systemic racism? Is there a correlation, and if there is, what is that correlation?
Do you want me to start, or go, Sully? Why don't you, Professor Sullivan? I would love to hear your response to that.
So say a little more about the question, James. The core value.
Yeah, so we have the core values of caring, honesty, respect, and responsibility. How do those core values correlate or relate to the issues of systemic racism that we're seeing manifest themselves throughout the country?
Well, systemic racism rejects all of those values. They are antagonistic to those values. The absence of those values provide the fuel that allows systemic racism to survive. So here's what I'd say. We use systemic racism, obviously, to talk about systems, to talk about structures that behave in a way to perpetuate racism. And when we talk about systemic racism in this way, sometimes we forget that human beings are behind these structures and do indeed make decisions to put in motion things that work more or less autonomously. We can't forget the fact that human beings are behind the institutions that aid in this atmosphere of systemic racism. In other words, systemic racism is not AI. It's not artificial intelligence. Sentient human beings are the programmers to this machine that we refer to as systemic racism. Now, the way to push back systemic racism, or I should say a way to push back systemic racism, is really in a full-on embrace of the sorts of values that you spoke about. Because if, in fact, we do embrace those values, you couldn't sleep at night knowing that someone is suffering in the way that we see our fellow human beings suffering in this world. You couldn't sleep at night. I worked that out in the criminal justice arena. I don't sleep well at night when I know people are locked up in cages because they're poor. I can't do it. I can't do it. And we have to fully embrace this sense of taking personal responsibility and not allowing injustice to persist. For people who've heard me before, I say it all the time, and forgive me for being redundant, but justice is something that doesn't just drop down out of the sky and land on your desk. Here's justice. There we go. It's done. No, justice is something that we have to do, that we have to make justice happen. Justice is not some pristine concept that exists in some Platonic world to which we have no access. Justice is a thing that people do, that they make happen, that they insist on happening. And if we fully embrace these core values, then the stuff we see on the ground would be wholly inconsistent with that. And we feel impelled to do something. And I use that word decidedly. And since this is a King Day forum, I've always been just absolutely fascinated with King's choice of using the word impelled in his letter to the Birmingham jail. Not that I felt compelled to do it, not that I felt that I had to. He said I felt impelled to get out there and do something, which just conjures up a notion that, you know, even if I don't feel like it, I've got to go out and do it, because there are some other values that propel me, that push me, that you know, gird me. And these values won't allow me to rest unless and until I address these sorts of inequalities that lead to just grossly disparate existences among folks. I'm certainly blessed, and Eddie and you, James, in many ways, particularly coming from, well, at least how Eddie and I we're very different points than where we started from growing up, and you know, and it's because in large part, obviously, you know, my parents, but also people along the way who just gave a damn, actually just cared, cared enough to inconvenience themselves even a bit to help out somebody else. We get more of that in this country, more of that in this world, than institutions like systemic racism won't have the oxygen to survive much longer.
Right. Well said.
Wow.
Eddie.
Yeah, I mean, that was just spot on. I mean, at the heart of, see, we need to understand that at the heart of systemic racism, at least on my view, right, and I think it's a view that seems reasonable, is a certain valuation of who's worthy and who's not. And it finds itself, it evidences itself, right, in the very ways in which the society is organized. And so it's perpetuated, not by way of just simply intent, right? But just as my colleague Ruha Benjamin talks about in Race After Technology, human beings are part of this structure, but the structures don't necessarily require somebody to be, you know, deliberately racist, right? But the valuation is built into the very structures themselves. And so a good friend of ours, one of our closest partners, Paul Taylor, who has written this extraordinary book on race and philosophy, he talks about racism at its heart being something about disregard. Exactly, Doc, exactly. Being about disregard, the devaluation of Black bodies. At the heart of the American project is what I call the value gap, this belief that white people matter more than others. And to the extent to which that belief obtains, it evidences itself in our social, political, and economic arrangements, and it constitutes the through line of American history. What the value gap is going to look like in the context of the material conditions of slavery will be very different than what it would look like in the context of Jim Crow, which will be very different in the context of our first Black president. But you still have a society that's organized in such a way where Black bodies are disregarded and white bodies are valued differently in a particular sort of way. So what would it mean to foreground the values of the YMCA? It goes back to my first point. Human beings aren't disposable because of the color of their skin or who they love or where they happen to be born, right? Or their ability or the like, right? Human beings are valued or cherished for who they are. And we create the conditions under which that they can actually not only dream dreams, but make those dreams a reality. Dr. King understood. And see, this is the interesting thing. We pick his bones clean, right? Over the last 50-something years, right? And people, conservatives will draw on Dr. King. Liberals will draw on Dr. King. Black politicians will use him for their own selfish ambition. And oftentimes we freeze him in 1966, 63, the March on Washington, or some of us might skip to Selma in 1965, but the Dr. King of 66 and 67 and 68, the one who was grappling with deep and profound depression, the man who was no longer, right, seen as this moral figure that everyone should listen to. He was in fact persona non grata. Black Power, Black Power proponents calling him a sellout, right? New York Times review of books and Los Angeles Times saying that the Times had passed him by. But he had turned his attention to the structural nature, right, of racism in the country. There was a reason why he wanted to do the Poor People's Campaign. He said, right, integrating lunch counters didn't cost as much. But what we have to deal with, right, are the three triplets, those three triple evils of racism and militarism and materialism, right, that will leave people behind, that will leave people in the shadows. And that vision was motivated by a set of commitments, a set of values that are consonant with the values of the YMCA, that are not just simply values that ought to animate our individual action. Of course, that's important, but it should animate the very way in which we live together as a community, as a nation, you see. And so it's really important to understand that Dr. King in his last days, who's suffering from depression, who thinks that, Americans are just racist, he said, that perhaps the country might need to be just razed to the ground, he thought. Right? That in some ways, that the economic ideology at the heart of the American project, right, so devalued the personality of individual human beings that we may need to rethink it all together, you see. So what does it mean for the YMCA to embrace these values? And what does it mean for those values to animate our response to systemic racism? It demands a society that is based on the value and dignity and standing of every human being, to try to create the conditions for them to become who God has called them to be. If somebody didn't inconvenience themselves for me and Sully or Professor Sullivan, we wouldn't be here, right? And I'm not talking about charity, the conditions. We're talking about those grants. We're talking about Morehouse taking a risk on a brother who didn't score very high on the ACT. I mean, I could go on and on and on and on and on about, the chances, right? So part of what I'm trying to get at, James, and I'm sorry I'm preaching here.
No, this is beautiful.
Amen,
But
brother.
beautiful.
I'm trying to get at, what does it mean to embrace the value? It's not just simply about virtue signaling. It's not reducible to individual acts. Dr. King, the bottom half of his face was blown off because he sacrificed his life for a world that would be organized on the basis of those values, evidenced in how we budget, evidenced in how we educate, evidenced in how we care. So what is the relationship between your core values and systemic racism? It means you dedicate your life to fighting it, to trying to get rid of it, to trying to build a better world. Right? That's my view. That's my view of the relationship between the two.
Well, that is a powerful view, and one that I will confirm that we embrace here at the Y of Greater Boston, and we are deeply committed to doing what is necessary to be done to create that value that you talk about, that making sure that we are valuing every human being that we have the honor and the blessing to be able to serve. And we recognize the place that Ron referenced in his comments, that this is our responsibility in this particular time, and if others are not going to do it, it is our responsibility to do it and to do it well, and to drive it. I will try to summarize some of what we've heard today, but I will fail at it. My summary will be a failure. I will admit that from the beginning. But that being said, I I'm deeply moved by both of you and what you have shared with us this morning. I do not believe that we could have had a better, more enlightening, more thoughtful, more challenging, more elevating of our consciousness than the conversation that you have just provided us with. You have challenged us to recognize how frail democracy is in our country, and how it is our responsibility to do what we must do in order to shore it up and support it. Because without that effort, democracy might see its last days in our country. And it reminded me immediately, the first thought that came to my mind was our youth in government program, where we teach high school students how to be legislators, how to be lawyers, and how to be journalists, and put them in state houses and let them pretend to play those roles out and put in front of them the challenges of the day and have them find the solutions. And so I am recommitting our organization to that particular work. Go ahead, Eddie. I
don't want to interrupt you, James, but I was the first Black youth governor of the YMCA state legislature program in Mississippi. So I was a benefit of that very program.
There you go. Yeah, so
Tony Lay in Mississippi, absolutely.
That is exactly it. I oftentimes share that I would not be in the YMCA movement to this very day if I hadn't been a volunteer supporting our youth in government program in Springfield, Massachusetts, where we had one of the most accomplished delegation of young Black and brown, young people leading the charge in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts around our state government. It was an awesome experience. Here I am today because of that very experience. So yes, youth in government is one of the ways that we shore up racism, because as we say in youth in government, as you might remember, Eddie, the democracy lives generation by generation. It isn't, Ron, as you put it, isn't something that is just there. You have to act on it, right? And so we have to act on the democracy. So I thank you for sharing that with us. What an amazing morning and conversation you have provided us with. Again, I don't think that we could have been more enlightened than by the two of you. I'm deeply moved by the time that you have set aside and spent with us today. But I'm even more deeply moved by the energy and inspiration that you've provided to all of us to continue to do the work that needs to be done in order to create the kind of society and community that we all deserve, and that all of us deserve to experience each and every day. I thank you for all you do every single day in the work that you do individually. I know that you are doing the work that needs to be done today. And thank you very much for all the hard work that you put into, formulating the ideas and thoughts that you've shared with us this morning. And so I'll offer both of you an opportunity to share your own closing remarks. And why don't we start with the reverse order? Why don't we start with you, Ron, and then followed by Eddie.
Well, first, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation with my lifelong friend over there, and I hope it's beneficial to the listeners. So one of the things I'd say in closing on King Day, and I'll say something similar to what I said when I gave the King note, the King Day keynote, is that we should use this day to reflect on what King has said in order to motivate what we do. In other words, King's life was a call to action. And really, and I don't want this to go too long. I mean, most commentators about King cut King in the early King and later King. And Eddie got at the latter King when he started talking about not just Black and brown people, but poor people and the economy and the way in which, even with civil rights, if you couldn't afford to experience them, If you have the right to go to a hotel but couldn't afford the bill, then there's still a huge problem here. One of the things that we learned from the civil rights movement generally, which is much broader than Martin Luther King, although he remains the public face of it, is that to the degree that you want change in the community, you have to be thoughtful and creative and dogged in your pursuit. Unfortunately, I take issue with some of the stories that we tell ourselves about the civil rights movement. Sometimes it's as though people just got out the bed and start marching and singing "We Shall Overcome" and so forth and so on, and we forget the stories of people like Wyatt T. Walker, folks who, how many steps is it going to take to get from this university to this store? And if you're older, how many more steps and how much longer is it going to take? When this group gets arrested, what's going to happen with the next? This stuff was planned. It was thoughtful. It was strategic, nonviolent reaction, strategic in order to effect a result. But all of it was undergirded and motivated, though, by a strong and solid moral foundation. It was moral claims being made through a particular strategic spectrum, right? So one of the lessons of King is to let's be thoughtful and let's be strategic about how we are going to address these systems. I'll end by telling a story about Rosa Parks that we don't hear too much, right? We hear the Montgomery bus boycott story, and Rosa Parks decided not to get up. And then, at least I grew up hearing, preachers, her feet were tired, but her soul was rested. She didn't get up that day, and so forth and so on. Right? Rosa Parks was the secretary of the NAACP. They had other people who had done this. They sat there and said, who would be the best person? Who would be the best face of this thing? Rosa Parks said. She rose her hand. She said, yeah, I'll do it this day. I'll do it. Yeah, she just wake up in the morning like, yeah, let me not get off the bus. They planned this as a form of protest. It's the same courage that we understand the story, but there's a lot behind it too. So I would just say use King Day to have thoughtful engagement with a country that doesn't think much of us.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Eddie?
It's such a delight to be here with you guys. Thank you for this blessing of a conversation, Brother James, and to re-trigger, for having me remember what the YMCA was for me, how important that was for me. In my young
Eddie, if I can interrupt you, James, maybe we can convince Eddie to move back to Mississippi and actually become the governor, not just the youth governor, but the governor of Mississippi. If our friend and classmate Raphael Warnock can be a senator in Georgia, then I think there's space for Eddie to become governor of Mississippi.
Awesome. I concur.
So moved.
Yes.
Two quick things. One is, just as Sully says that, you have to do the work around justice, we need to understand that freedom is not an end. Freedom is a practice. Right? Freedom is not an end, it's a practice. So, if we're going to embody freedom, right, in the way we live our lives, we need to understand that involves, right, working for the kind of society that evidences the values that we've been talking about so much today. And then the second point I want to do is I want to read something from Toni Morrison. There's a little small piece in the Sources of Self-Regard in Morrison's book of essays. And Martin Luther King III called her to ask her her thoughts about Dr. King. And she suddenly got really anxious. And she writes this last paragraph. I know the world is better, finer, because he lived in it. My anxiety was personal. Was I better? Finer? Because I've lived in a world that is imaginary. Would Dr. King be disappointed in me? Important, but the question really is, and that is the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., she writes. He made the act of assuming personal responsibility for alleviating social harm ordinary, habitual, irresistible. My tribute to him is the profound gratitude I feel for the gift that his life truly was. Ask yourself the question, would he be disappointed in me?
Wow. Yes. Yes. That's awesome. Thank you both. So I want you to hear something from me. And I'm speaking for everyone who will ultimately view this, and that is this: we have great love and admiration for the two of you. And with that, I will bring our conversation to a close. I will bid you good health and continued success in the work that you are doing to bring about social justice in our great country. Thank you very, very much for being with us today. We're so honored to have you with us. This has been such a wonderful conversation. We are all inspired and moved by your words, by the depth of your thinking, and by your challenges that you've placed in front of us. So thank you very much, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you now.
Good morning, beloved community. I'm Catherine Saunders, the Executive Director at the Roxbury YMCA. I thank you for joining us this morning in celebrating Dr. King. Thank you to our sponsors, our supporters, our Roxbury Board of Advisors, YMCA staff, Pastor Broderick, and the young people from the Achievers Program. Thank you to our moderator, Y CEO James Morton, and distinguished panelists, Dr. Glaude and Dr. Sullivan. Your message this morning of our shared responsibility and how we are called to step up for one another by showing more charity and more caring for our neighbors is right on time. And I am so proud of the work that we've been blessed to do over these last 10 months with the help of countless community partners and friends. We provided meals and groceries to our youth, our families, and our cherished elders. We've opened community learning centers, supported our students' virtual learning, and provided essential care for working families. All of this has been possible because of you, because of your support, your generosity, your love, and your commitment to our collective beloved community. On behalf of our Roxbury Y family, our young people, our seniors, and our staff, and everyone who calls our YMCA home, we thank you, we appreciate you, and we love you. Happy birthday, Dr. King. Thank you for joining us.